Now we will continue with our next lecturer, that is Mr. Harris.
All that's rather difficult to beat, so I will not be competitive, but complementary, as well as complimentary. But I'll start off on this question of honesty, corruption, and so on, because I think it's very interesting, apart from anything else. The perceptions of corruption are, I think, so subject to media comment and political manipulation, for example, by the esteemed George Soros and his agencies, that it is, shall we say, a more flexible concept even than the other economic concepts that you were talking about. The actual Transparency International organization is a highly political affair. And here in Croatia, without going into it, for several years, I don't know whether it's even been concluded yet, a series of lawsuits were underway between different contenders for the title of Croatian Transparency International. One group broadly of the sort of Soros-leaning left, and the others, I would have said, more reasonable, but they would have said, of course, patriotic right. But anyway, so it's highly subjective. Now, that isn't to say that it isn't important. I think it's actually immensely important, but it's just that we have to recognize that it is so subjective. And I, particularly since coming here to live permanently 6 years ago, have obviously thought a lot about why Croatian government is so corrupt, which it is. And I come to certain conclusions. One is that although one sees a lot of media coverage about great big scandals, bank accounts which have been full of apparently INA money, which it is inexplicable that they could have got there, and so on and so on. I think that the damage that is done to a society, and possibly to an economy too, is not just the corruption at the top, it's the corruption at each layer all the way down. If you feel that there is almost nothing you can do without either paying a bribe or suggesting that you might be willing to pay a bribe, then people will not even seek permission to act legally at all. Now, this involves an immense cost. Hernando de Soto was talking about some of these costs years ago, but they really are huge, and I don't think that that element of corruption is understood properly, particularly here in Croatia. The other reason why people should be corrupt, there is a relationship, and it's a two-way relationship between corruption and incompetence. Some people are corrupt because they are incompetent, because they cannot do their job, or at least keep their jobs, or even put a face on doing their jobs, unless they are prepared to take bribes, or to do favors, or to do what somebody who is important wants them to do. And this is basically because they are incompetent. But of course, corruption also allows the promotion of incompetent people. Now, quite what the relationship between this is, I think the relationship between incompetence and corruption is probably different in different parts of the world. But here I would say that the lingering influence of communism is very, very important, because if you have a situation, as was the case in 1989, 1990, when nearly all of the key positions in the state, and those who are even equipped to apparently to hold the key positions of the state, when almost all of these people were communists. They were either communists in sense of members of the party, or they were accepted by the party, or they had enjoyed benefits from the party. These people were in these positions and are still in public sector positions because of the party, because of the past. And we have in the public sector here an hereditary class of incompetence. Now, I don't mean everybody in the public sector is incompetent at all, but they're basically incompetent because their families got the job because they were communists. Now, to deal with that, I think you have to be clear that just talking about just trying to deal with crime and so on, and to deal with corruption, isn't really at the root of the solution. The root of the solution here is that you have to have a system of government. I think this does mean very much, incidentally, in this part of the world, a system of small government, because you can't trust anybody in government to do anything very much, let alone do it properly. So really small government with few opportunities for corruption, which is one of the things that the great liberal model does. And also, of course, to educate people better. Educate people better so that they are actually able to do all of the things that is required to run a modern state. Well, I'll leave that about my thoughts on corruption. I want also to, because in the first session, we, quite legitimately, we moved from what freedom is into how economic freedom operates and didn't operate in Croatia, quite legitimately. But I'd like to go back just a little to this idea of what freedom is, and I think tomorrow it's going to be touched on again. Well, I very much like Alex Chaffwin's definition, the right of that economic freedom is the right of adults to try to do, interesting there, to try to do what they want with what they own, which seems to me absolutely right. Now, this right to try to do, etc., this right is, of course, guaranteed them by the state. Not by anybody else, it's by the state. And it is a misunderstanding of rights and what the state, the relationship between the state and the rights that the state should provide, that lies at the heart of a great deal of confusion about what modern liberty is. Now, Burke was very skeptical about natural rights. He didn't say that natural rights didn't exist. He just said that ideas of natural right had almost no practical implications in politics. He wasn't, at this point, particularly interested in economics. But rights talk, which was the subject of a book by Mary Ann Glendon 30 years ago, which is worth looking at. I don't agree with everything in it, but it's an interesting study. This rights talk is really at the center of a lot of problems that we have. And rights have been extended, as Robert was saying earlier, to all sorts of material items to which they cannot properly apply. For example, the right to a well-paid job, or the right to an adequate standard of living. And these rights, these material rights, really became, I wouldn't say that they entered public discourse, but they were certainly given a huge boost by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948. And my own favorite, actually, of these rights is, as regards education, everybody, according to the Declaration of Human Rights, has the right to an education which should, please note, further the activities of the United Nations for the preservation of peace. Now, this as a definition of actually how everybody's curriculum should be organized seems to be somewhat ambitious. In other words, it's ridiculous. Now, beyond that, we have a problem of language and we have a problem of priorities. The problem of language concerns a failure to distinguish a right from a claim. A right from a claim. Now, a right, if it really is a right, must override every condition. A claim need not. A claim is conditional. There are, as a result, very few rights. I would say that the essential right, and interestingly, perhaps the most disputed and dishonored right, is the right to life. The other rights, to good standard of living, nice health care, and this, that, and the other, well, these are simply not rights. These are claims. So that's the issue of language. And I really do think that it would be worth remembering this as you discuss and read about these matters. But there's also the question of priorities, in other words, the order. You see, when we assert a right, Mrs. Thatcher got into terrible trouble for saying all of this, but she said it in an interview in, I think it was 1989, with a woman's magazine. It was a very good interview. She got into terrible trouble. It's where she famously said there's no such thing as society. But what she meant by that was that when people said, oh, society should deal with this, society should deal with that, society should deal with the other, well, first of all, they meant the state. And essentially, they meant somebody else. They meant somebody else should deal with it. And the point underlying this is that every right involves the imposition and ultimately the acceptance of a duty. And every right or claim that is accepted by government thus involves an obligation by taxpayers that their income, their savings, whatever, should be used for what the government wants it to be used for, and that is an act of coercion. So that every time that a claim or a right of this sort, of this material sort, is accepted and promoted by government, there is a loss of liberty and an increase in coercion. Well, we can expect, or could have expected, that the arguments for the free economy would be not easily accepted, even if they had been reluctantly accepted at all on the left. But what we see in the world today is a lot of disenchantment among many conservatives with free enterprise, with the free economy, with capitalism. Well, why is this? I want to suggest some reasons and then draw some conclusions. Well, the first reason, I think, is that, as the book of Ecclesiastes said, there is nothing new under the sun. Bad ideas never really go away. They come back uttered by different people with different reasoning, but they remain bad ideas all the same. They represent, in fact, persisting intellectual temptations, and each generation yields to them. The second reason that this has happened is that after the West won the Cold War on the platform of freedom, liberty, it quickly forgot what freedom, liberty is. Now, part of freedom, not the whole of it, but part of it is that combination of private property, free exchange, competition, limited government, and a rule of law, which together constitute a system of economic liberty. Now, the third reason why conservatives are less than enamored of the free economy today is that today's rich global elite, the new masters of the universe, or at least the masters of capitalism, these people are by and large determined enemies of conservatism in all its forms. So it's perfectly natural and may, in some respects, be indeed justified and certainly enjoyable to teach them a lesson and knock them off their perches. Well, the fourth reason is that struggles for possession of and access to resources have, in many cases, gone beyond the level of economics and should be also considered matters of strategic security. Now, this is a slippery argument, but there is something in it. We should take it seriously, particularly, for example, as regards China, and I'll come back to that briefly. And finally, I think there is a reason with which I, as a conservative, can have complete sympathy, and that is that conservatives believe that economics is not the be-all and end-all of a good state policy. There may indeed be choices that a nation makes that involve its sacrificing certain economic gains for some greater good. And as conservatives, I feel we should have no objection to that. We should, though, insist that everyone is quite clear what it means, and that no one can get away with suggesting that you can pursue some interventionist course, like agricultural self-sufficiency, low carbon emissions, employment for all, universal health services free on demand, taxes that reduce equality rather than just raise revenues and so on, that you can pursue these objectives without paying a price, and that it may indeed be quite a high price. Well, having said all of that, let's get a few more other things straight. I think that the arguments for international free trade should be accepted, full stop. I don't think that we need to revisit all of these arguments because the facts do speak for themselves. The economic advance of the world under the successive GATT trade agreements was huge as tariffs fell. And in a parallel encounter with free market economics, countries in Africa and Asia gave up the old idea, which was encouraged, interestingly, by the World Bank in the 1960s, that these third world countries should become self-sufficient and practice what was called import substitution. Third world economics kept people in third world conditions. And this self-defeating socialist prescription, once it was abandoned, allowed poverty to shrink as it has. Now, Alex mentioned Chile as a good example, and it is. Chile lived for many years behind tariff walls, and it concentrated on the production and export, first of all, historically, of nitrates and then of copper, and it remained backward. There was a rich class there, but as a whole, it remained in what would be known as the third world. And then under the military government of General Pinochet and his colleagues, and with the advice of the Chicago boys, it removed tariffs, opened up its economy to the world. And there was, of course, an initial shock, but there was a huge inflow of investment. There was massive diversification. And Chile, for example, for the first time became an exporter of some of the best, mass exporter of some of the best wines in the world. And I can tell you, Croats, that you have competition certainly from Chile, and that if you haven't enjoyed Chilean wine, you certainly should. And Chile, consequently, on an extraordinary trajectory, moved from the third towards the first world. Unfortunately, it's stopped at the moment, and there will be all sorts of problems there. But really, the Chilean story is a fantastic success story, and you don't need military governments, but you need the right economic policy. Now, again, some countries depend much more on international trade than others. And as a result, some countries can actually get away with practicing what is rather miscalled protection in order to defend their domestic base. And the world's leading economy is thus a rather bad example of this, because the United States has a huge domestic economy, and international trade is just 10% of its GNP, I think. And of course, as a result of this, the US can slap on tariffs at will and has a history of doing so, but others face much greater difficulties and should be much more cautious about any impediments to trade. Another cautionary note, we really shouldn't be utopians and so on about this. It is extremely difficult to ensure that fair, almost however defined, fair trading conditions apply internationally. So-called dumping, another misused word, but a word which is perfectly, has a meaning and a useful one, in order to destroy the competition. That's an old tactic. China practiced it for years along with stealing intellectual property. And countervailing measures may sometimes be necessary and have been applied. But what we should remember is that these countervailing measures, they inflict a cost on the population of the country that imposes them. Well, getting back here to Croatia, of course, being within the European Union, the opportunities for restrictions on trade are pretty limited. So the discontent in Croatia with the present economic situation leads many Croats, again, on the right, not just the left, to call for an overall interventionist, new interventionist approach. For example, there is concern that the country is much too reliant on tourism, that more investment should go into industry, that the collapse of agriculture should be reversed, which is particularly disastrous in Slavonia, which is being depopulated, and so on. Now, to do any of this requires a whole series of interventions, which means covert or overt subsidies of one kind. And I would say that such arguments should be taken seriously. They should be argued out, each item by item. It may be that Croatia, because of tradition and interest, or perhaps because of the international situation, worry about its neighbors, the overall catastrophic exodus of workers and so on, may need to adopt some interventionist policies that neither David Ricardo nor Adam Smith would have approved of. But all I would say is this, is that if that is the case, the politicians have got to be open about it. And they've got to be open about the fact that any such diversions of capital and labor from where the market would otherwise have them impose a cost. And what this cost means is that the living standards of Croats will be lower than they would otherwise be. That's what it means. So as long as people are prepared to accept the country as a whole will be poorer, then you can have some of these interventions, but they should be openly debated. And incidentally, there's nothing particularly outlandish about this. In Britain, where I come from, one of the constant political disputes locally and nationally regards planning controls, that is the planning of residential building and the planning of factories and so on, particularly on what are called greenfield sites. And this is a very legitimate debate. The effect of planning controls not allowing development is to push up prices. It means that people cannot afford houses, or that your goods are priced out of markets. But mainly people cannot afford houses or cannot move to where it is necessary they should work, cheaply anyway. On the other hand, there is a good conservative argument, which I'm sure Burke, if he was around, would agree with, which is that our country's landscape is held in trust by one generation for another. That after all, once you concrete it over some land, and my goodness me, there's enough concrete if you look out of this hotel to remind us of this, once you concrete over land, it is very difficult to ever reclaim it for anything that is of any aesthetic value at all. Well, I mentioned Adam Smith, and I'm not going to go into all that the great Adam Smith said, but I will remind you of his famous remark that it is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. In other words, the self-interest of suppliers works to the good of consumers. Now this really we can't remind ourselves too frequently of. Suppliers also, of course, as Adam Smith says, as soon as they get together and can manage it, will work in some conspiracy against the public interest. They will contrive particularly to raise prices. And this immediately brings in the role of government, which has to hold hold the ring, directly or indirectly, to ensure that there is competition which works to the general good. Now, the government's role here is limited, and even an interventionist competition policy can lead to many, many problems. But it is legitimate and necessary, and the thing to remember is that government is at best an umpire, it is not a player on the field. Well, why? Here's Harris saying all this, you know, he's telling us this, that, and the other. Why? What's the proof? Well, Alex has actually shown a lot of the proof in his slides. And if we want to look to a little from the other side of the political spectrum, it was Tony Blair, who was a very successful politician, not a particularly successful prime minister, but a very successful politician, who famously said or told the Labour Party, "We know what works." And what he meant by that was he meant the free enterprise capitalism works, not your socialism. He didn't quite put it in those words, but that's what he meant. And he was right. And of course, the Heritage Foundation and the Fraser Institute and so on confirm that this is true, that other things being equal, other things are never completely equal. For example, these Nordics are incredibly law-abiding and honest and so on, and we Southerners are much less so. More interesting, I think. Well, you Southerners are certainly more interesting. I don't think Hannes is here, is he? No, there we are. And, but the fact is that the freer an economy is, the higher the prosperity of the people will be, other things being equal. And I think that if you compare the free with the unfree and the so-called repressed economies within this, you'll see that that is so. And Heritage also argues in some of the backcloth and argument to their index that even quite small increases in economic freedom lead to quite large increases in national income. Also worth remembering for those who say, oh, well, we will never get anywhere. You can get somewhere. And incidentally, this applies, we should say, when we look at the freest and the richest and the least free and the poorest. These comparisons apply whatever the political color of the government in power, whether it's left or right. Well, some conservatives just continue to sniff at all of this, but I tell you they should stop sniffing. I mean, I come from a country and was indeed involved in Mrs. Thatcher's politics. She understood perfectly well that conservatives have to provide an opportunity for people to get on in life and to improve their position, to increase their wealth, and to pass on, as she said, a better opportunities to the next generation than they had ever enjoyed, which is actually probably the real pursuit, the real purpose of free enterprise capitalism and the real definition of progress. Conservatives have to appeal to people who want to get on and not just to people who already have things. And I would say this too. Conservatives will never enjoy a majority, and have never enjoyed a majority, incidentally. They will never enjoy a majority working on cultural issues alone. They have to embrace policies which can deliver economic growth. And even national emergencies, Croats, Brits, we all, on the right, we like national, I mean, I don't like national emergencies. Some of you been to the front line, it will not be very pleasant. But the point is, a national emergency, somehow we feel, well, this is what it's really all about, you know, this is the interests of the country have to be defended and so on. A crisis. And I think that conservative-minded people are better in a crisis than liberals, I'm not sure about socialists, but yes, than liberals. But having said all of this, the result of wars, the greatest crisis, is always that collectivism, state control, the left advance. It is always the case. We could go into why that is, but it is the case of the First World War, the Second World War, and so on, that conservatives should avoid crises if they can, and not believe that crises are going to deliver them power. Well, enough has been said about, I was going to say some more things about Friedrich Hayek, but I think enough has been said about him. I think that Hayek, I agree with Alex, I agree with Hannes. I think Hayek is the most important, single most important liberal, conservative, libertarian, goodness, whatever you want to call it, thinker. And I think, the Road to Serfdom in particular, which is in Croatian, should be read by all. Hayek goes a step beyond Adam Smith. You see, Adam Smith was conscious that there was what he called an invisible hand at work in the economy, which ensured that the general good, in some rather mysterious way, but actually that's what happened, the general good was served, prosperity was served, even when people were only trying to pursue individual good. But Hayek, very fruitfully, develops from that this idea of a spontaneous order, that the order that we have in society, the order that we perceive, is something which is not being imposed by a central planning authority and can never be reconstructed by some all-knowing central planning authority because there's not enough information, anyway, because they can't be trusted. So we should regard all radical change to these existing orders with suspicion, and we should understand that the great impulse for improvement and progress comes not from government, but from choices made in the market. Well, Hayek came to, Hannes was mentioning this, towards the end of 1979. I was working for the Conservative Party by then, and he came to see Mrs. Thatcher. He'd given a little lecture at Conservative headquarters, and I think I was probably one of the only people who thought it was great stuff, because they were really stuck in the Heathite collectivist era. I wasn't. But it was on that occasion, and she talked to me about it years later, that Hayek went in to see Mrs. Thatcher, and what they actually discussed was the problem of the trade unions, which are immensely powerful in Britain and far more problematic than here. And he explained to her his view, which if you wish to read about, the following year he published a very interesting little booklet produced by the Institute of Economic Affairs on the problem of the trade unions. And he talked to her about the problem of the British trade unions and said that the basic issue was that trade unions had been given in Britain legal privileges which effectively put them above the law. What do we mean by the law? We mean by the rule of law, the rule of law. And that had to be changed. And he told her, he said, I can't tell you how you can do it, but I'm telling you what's got to be done. And she then did it. She did it step by step. She used cunning, common sense, tactics, timing, and so on. And that's what politicians have to do. And that's, I suppose, in a way, what we're trying to do, because I'm not in politics and certainly don't intend to get involved in politics. But what we have to do is to provide what has gone so sadly awry over recent years. We have to provide an intellectual underpinning and wider understanding of what we're talking about today, the free economy, and why the free economy works, why it is morally justified, why contrary to all of these temptations, I call these intellectual temptations, to go for shortcuts, direct action by government and so on, that these things do not work, that we need patience, and we need to understand that we live in an imperfect world with very, very imperfect politicians. And we have to create a framework. A framework, that's the most important thing. Mrs. Thatcher, there were two things that she would talk about at great length. One was the rule of law, the importance of it, because without that, she said, there could be no operating market at all, and obviously no proper society, a rule of law. And the other thing was a framework. And a framework, that's all that government can provide, is a framework for people to live their lives. And as regards government, and getting back to this question of corruption is concerned, we have to provide a framework within which the Croatian politicians have an interest in behaving well, and in which competent, creative, well-educated, one hopes honest, politicians go into government and solve the huge numbers of problems that are unresolved, mainly because of the poisoned legacy of socialism. Thank you.